me to talk to you this afternoon. So I'm presenting a bit of an overview of the work we've been doing for quite a few years on the role of waterholes in supporting the biota in intermittently flowing rivers and how that fits in with the environmental aspects of water planning. So I'm going to give a little bit of an overview first of the general approach we use, which I think some of you already know, having seen Glenn's talk a few weeks ago, but I'll just go quickly through this anyway. So water planning in Queensland aims to balance outcomes, and one of the outcomes is water to sustain dependent environmental values within a water plan area as one of the core considerations of decisions made in water plans. So science supports this process by undertaking environmental assessments. So the rationale of how we do that is we identify assets which are indicators of the environmental values and which are dependent on aspects of the flow regime. We quantify those dependencies. We take the hydrological scenarios that are produced by Queensland Hydrology and we plug them into ecological models, which generate flow-based opportunities for the particular ecological asset we're talking about. We then evaluate those opportunities against thresholds of concern about the frequency and the spell duration. Often it relates to how long it is between opportunities. And then where necessary, depending on the type of value we're talking about, we integrate that spatially within the water plan area. And that relates then to a scenario risk assessment, which compares different scenarios of water management being considered back to the pre-development case for that particular area. And this is all published in the paper that's cited at the bottom, and which I'm sure Glenn talked about in a fair bit of detail a month or so ago. The process that we follow is governed and guided by the Water Planning Science Plan, which I'm sure everyone here is aware of and is in its second iteration. We're in the 2020 to 2030 version, the first one being the 5-year 2014 to 2019 plan. And basically it documents the approach I just very quickly went through and guides research to fill knowledge gaps in relation to various themes within that process. There's a pyramid, an upside down pyramid of filtering that we go through in this process. So we start off with a threat analysis, which characterizes what are the hydrological threats to ecosystems in a particular plan area. How does that relate to assets that are potentially influenced by these threatening processes? What is the knowledge that we have about the requirements of those assets? And that is often the stage at which a lot of the science, the developed research that we need to undertake and that the regional biologists around the state also undertake is often in relation to that stage about what are the requirements of the assets in particular to quantify them. And then the final stage is the environmental assessment, which is a quantitative risk modelling approach, and that the outcomes of that inform the decisions that the policymakers and the minister make around allocation within plans to generate acceptable levels of risk to the various outcomes of the plan, including to the ecology. Now, Queensland and much of Australia, in fact, is dominated by rivers that have intermittent flow regimes. And this work that was done by Mark Kennard 10 years or so ago showed that all but 2 of the gauges that they assessed in Queensland had intermittent flow regimes of various types. And this is particularly a prominent aspect of the hydrology and the ecology of what are dryland rivers, which are places where annual evaporation exceeds annual rainfall. Assets from water plans that are related to intermittent rivers, vary throughout the state, but I'm focusing a fair bit of my talk today about the dryland rivers of the Queensland Murray-Darling Basin. This is largely because the majority of the research into the way waterholes function and how the ecology of the system depends on waterholes has been undertaken in the Murray-Darling Basin. Now, I've got a list here of some of the main assets that have been used in Queensland Murray-Darling Basin water plans, and the ones that are underlined are the ones that are directly related to waterholes. Some of the others are peripherally also related, but these ones are very much dependent on waterholes for the viability of these assets. So some key questions when you start thinking about how waterholes operate in these systems. The first question is, well, what do they do? And I'll come to that in a second. But once we understand that, we want to know, where are they? We want to know, how long do they last in the landscape once flow ceases? We want to know, what are the determinants of this? We want to know, when do they actually fail? Is it when they're dry, or is it before they're dry? We want to understand some of the threats to their function. And we also want to, I'm also going to give, an overview of a little bit about how this research and understanding has fed into policy in water plans. Now, why are waterholes so critical in dryland rivers? Well, they go through what's been colloquially called a boom and bust ecology. The bust time is during the droughts, or when flow has not been happening for quite some time, and the amount of habitat shrinks considerably. In this diagram, we can see the potential carrying capacity of the system could be quite large, but during the drought bust times, that carrying capacity shrinks down to a much smaller area. This is the resistance phase. This is where organisms that have no capacity to live out of water have to resist the drought by living in places where water is still present. Once the drought ends, we go into a resilience phase, which is where the populations of organisms bounce back, if you like, from the disturbance of drought. They recolonize, they breed, their population size increases, and this is the boom. So the boom is when the carrying capacity increases back to a large number, possibly to the full extent of its ability, of the system's ability to support them, and this is the recovery. So these systems go through repeated and constant cycling between these phases of drought and resistance, and then resilience and recovery. Waterholes are the key element of this, like I said, for biota that do not have the capacity to live out of water. Like there are a lot of organisms in these systems that don't need water. Some freshwater mussel species can just sit in the mud for years. Some freshwater turtle species can crawl under logs and bury in the mud for quite long extended periods. And a lot of insects and small planktonic organisms and so forth have desiccation resistant eggs and other life history stages, so they can just wait out the dry times. But if you're a fish or some other species of turtles or freshwater shrimps, for example, you need there to be actual water present for you to remain alive. So the longer the bust period or the drought period goes, the greater the threat to the resistance of the populations of these animals. And this diagram, which has been much reproduced, illustrates how the longer a dry period goes, the fewer waterholes persist, and the greater is the extinction risk for a particular population at a regional or a meta-community scale. So the first of our questions, where are the waterholes? We took advantage of the fact that we went through a regional-wide extreme drought in 2018 to 2020 to map where the most persistent waterholes are throughout the whole of the Queensland Murray-Darling. Now this drought was quite bad everywhere, but in some places it was very severe. Like, for example, this gauge from the lower Moonie, the previous longest drought on record was about 300 days, and this one was about 600 days. And that's just illustrated with the two plots at the bottom. But one of the key characteristics about this drought compared with others was it was synchronous across the whole region, whereas in the past, many of the others had some parts of the system still wet while others were dry. So the satellite mapping used Sentinel, and this was work that we outsourced to our colleagues at Aussie Spatial. We use observations taken during the drought, mainly by the regional biologists in Toowoomba, to calibrate the satellite image water thresholds and therefore identify where remnant water was in the landscape. The figure on the right is a graphical summation of the entire Queensland Murray-Darling Basin, where the size of the circles represents how much waterhole habitat persisted at the peak of the drought, and the little connectors between them represent the likelihood of fish being able to pass through dams and weirs. So basically, we divided the whole system up in this diagram based on the locations of dams and weirs. And I've done a blown up of the legend, so because it's too hard to read otherwise. But basically, almost all the sections defined by the location of all these dams and weirs had somewhere between 1 to 10 hectares, and often some of them less. And there were even some sections where there was no remnant waterholes at all that were isolated by barriers. Summarising those findings across the whole region, overall there was only 11% of the major river channels that retained water, and there was a gradient from east to west decreasing in how much of the channel retained water, with the Paroo being as low as 5%. I think the Condamine Ballan was a little bit boosted because there was the stock and domestic release from Beardmore Dam during the drought, which had some good benefit in sustaining some waterholes that probably otherwise would have dried. Next question is, how long do they last? This has been a subject of research throughout Queensland, but lots of the different regions have been studying their own waterholes in this way. But it's all been following the general logic that we first developed for our study in the Moonie River back in the early to mid 2000s. And we had a fairly strong collaboration with John Witkowski back in the day when we were developing this, and he helped develop process models which we applied and have been adopted for water planning ever since. So basically, this is a simple conceptual model of how long a waterhole lasts, with the time that flow has stopped as a key driver, water inputs and losses as key drivers, and then the geomorphology of the waterhole itself as a key determinant as well. So basically, if you've got a deep waterhole and a short spell without flow, it's unlikely to dry up, but if it's the other way around, it's more likely to dry up. And we have the main parameters that we need to understand are these loss rates and gain rates. So in the Murray-Darling, we've studied, we being us and the regional biologists in Toowoomba, have studied 65 waterholes. We've mapped them with sonar to develop digital elevation models so we can understand the relationship between area, depth, and volume. We've installed depth loggers over extended periods of drying to understand the rate at which they lose water. We've used climate and flow data from silo and from gauges, and the modelling approach that JV helped us develop to calibrate these models so that a model represents the observed water loss rates. And this is done largely by tweaking parameters associated with seepage loss and multipliers on daily evaporation rates obtained from silo. It takes the bathymetry of the waterhole into account in that process too. So once we have a calibrated model, we can then turn off all the inputs and run it to empty and estimate how long it will retain water. We've done that for these 65, possibly even more by now, waterholes, and come up with a strong relationship between depth at cease to flow and persistence time. And this is what we might call a universal Queensland Murray-Darling water loss equation, which is basically 1 metre of water lasts 170 days. And that's been fairly consistent across all the catchments that we have looked at in the Murray-Darling. The Warrego and the Paroo haven't really been included in that, but at the moment, the guys in Toowoomba have some sites in the Warrego that, well, it hasn't really stopped flowing much this year, has it? But eventually they hopefully will get some drawdown data to calibrate models for out there too. Now, you may wonder how important groundwater is, because if there's groundwater connectivity to a waterhole, it may sustain it longer than if there isn't. So this was a question we have had all along. We did some work with CSIRO back in the early 2000s, looking at this for the first time. We also did some work with researchers based at Griffith University out in the Cooper Creek, even before that. And since then, we've done some work with University of Queensland researchers and others in the Condamine-Ballon system. And throughout all of those systems, there's very little indication of groundwater input into waterholes. They tend to be very much evaporation-driven systems. There are a few waterholes, like you can see the bottom left peak. The bottom left plot is radon concentration along the river through all the waterholes we sampled. And there are a couple of peaks, particularly that Altonvale one, where there was some indication that groundwater was entering. But in the few cases we found like that, it seems like these are leaky waterholes where the groundwater doesn't sustain them longer during dry periods, but they actually lose water to groundwater faster. So they're probably not very good refuge sites, the ones that do have some linkage to groundwater. But throughout the Condamine-Ballon, for instance, very little indication of groundwater input into waterholes. So once we know how long waterholes last, and we'll be able to predict that from simple measurements of depth, the next thing we wanted to know is what's the landscape of persistence look like? Are all the deep ones clustered together? Are they spread around? Are there very few deep persistent ones, or are they everywhere? And before we developed the techniques to do this by satellite image analysis, we did it by sonar mapping the Moonie River over a distance of over 200 kilometers by dragging this kayak along with a sonar system in it. And that logjam is just one of over 300 such log jams that we encountered in that 200 kilometer survey. And this is what it looked like. The depth has been converted into persistence using that formula I showed you earlier. So you can see there's a fair bit of variability along the channel in where the deep parts of the waterhole are and how long they last. This is like the distribution of those persistence times. You can see there's not that many waterholes that last a year, and there's very few that last 2 years. So most of them last somewhere in the 100 to 200 sort of day window. At the time we applied that to the existing IQQM outputs for the Moonie at the time. This was back in the 2000s, so this is pretty old data. And at that time, the maximum no-flow spell under pre-development was at 496 days, and the maximum no-flow spell under full entitlement case was nearly 800 days. And applying that to our 200 kilometres of data here, we see that at the worst case drought during the pre-development, we had about 13% of the channel retaining water. But if we apply that full entitlement option, it was down to less than 1%, so 0.2, only less than half a kilometre of waterhole for that whole 200 kilometres. So you can see here how increasing drought duration, be it from water resource development or from climate change or whatever, poses a massive threat to the fish that need to have somewhere to live during these times. So just thought I'd quickly go on to explain how this information has been incorporated into the environmental assessment that was done for the most recent Moonie water plan. And I'm concentrating on that landscape aspect here. There was also work done on some of the individual waterholes and whether they were likely to be affected in their persistence under different scenarios being tested. But so this is the logic that was laid out. This is from Glenn's work. So we're looking at populations of organisms that require a network of waterholes to persist through extended dry periods. That's the significance of the waterholes. At the plan area scale, remote sensing time series analysis was used along with hydrological information to determine where persistent waterholes were located after various no-flow spell durations across the catchment, basically. And this supports ecological values directly related to the outcomes of the Moonie water plan. So we're assessing the spatial distribution of waterholes. We were measuring the frequency and maximum duration of individual waterhole failures at those ones that we modelled individually, but at the landscape, we're looking at multiple simultaneous failures at the assessment area scale. So the assessment area scale being parts of the system that are directly related to individual gauges, because not all of the system can be directly attributed to the hydrology at a gauge. We looked at Landsat from 1988 to 2015, and the simultaneous failure of waterholes within those assessment reaches was the threshold that was being considered. So the result of this was throughout the Moonie, there was 7.6 square kilometres of waterhole habitat identified, which was defined as where there was water after 3 months following the cessation of flow. And of that 7.6 square kilometres, 1.3 square kilometres was permanent during the Landsat era, which meant during that period, they were still present during the longest no-flow spell from the gauge record that corresponded with the Landsat era. So there was, based on that, there was no simultaneous loss of waterholes entirely from within assessment reaches, and it was considered to be low risk from the full entitlement scenario in that water plan. Right, so a lot of that is talking about presence or absence of water, and obviously absence of water, I didn't ask it to do that. Obviously absence of water is a big risk to a fish. So we don't have any fish that are able to survive without water in our systems. Other parts of the world there are some, but we don't have any. So when it's dry, we know the fish are dead. However, conditions become increasingly harsh as waterholes shallow, and drying waterholes can also become a lethal prospect for fish and other organisms. So there's temperature fluctuations, algal blooms, oxygen crashes, concentrations of toxic chemicals such as phenols that can accumulate from eucalyptus leaves, various other threats. And my slides have started deciding they want to run themselves. And everyone is probably aware of the fact that fish can die without waterholes drying up from the massive Menindee fish kills that happened in the summer of 2018, 2019 at Menindee in New South Wales, and which was a massive news story at the time and has triggered a whole bunch of investment from the Commonwealth into various things since. So our current threshold for failure of a waterhole that we use at the moment in water planning is 50 centimetres, and this is considered to be the depth at which environmental conditions become too harsh to sustain healthy biota. And I mentioned some of these as high and variable temperature, low dissolved oxygen, algal blooms, lack of food and habitat for the fish that live there. And there's also biological effects such as competition, predation, and disease, which escalate the more concentrated the organisms are within a smaller habitat volume. This threshold was adopted based on some work that CSIRO and James Cook University did in the Flinders and Gilbert rivers, and that was largely driven by the temperature regime of waterholes becoming what they thought was unsuitable for maintaining fish shallower than 50 centimetres. But we don't have a lot of evidence really that in our systems, particularly in the Murray-Darling, 50 centimetres is a good threshold. And so some of the work we've been doing more recently has been focused on whether 50 centimetres or something else should be adopted as when waterholes fail and no longer work well at supporting biota during dry phases. So this project was initially funded by the Queensland Water Modelling Network and is ongoing via funding from the Federation Funding Agreement for the implementation of the Basin Plan. So we're looking here at trying to model the oxygen and temperature regime of waterholes during periods without flow and understand the risks that those regimes pose to fish that live in them. So we've had instrumentation in 6 waterholes in the Murray-Darling, measuring temperature and dissolved oxygen through the depth profile with data loggers. Some of those have been ours and some of those have belonged to the guys in Toowoomba. We've worked with physical modelers, University of Western Australia, to integrate our data into models that can predict what's being observed. And this uses river hydrology, so cessation of flow. It uses local meteorological conditions. And then we've incorporated our understanding of persistence into there as well. And we've also worked with colleagues at University of Queensland to better understand the ecophysiological tolerances of the fish that do live in our systems in the Queensland Murray-Darling. That's been brought together into models that represent the habitable volume of waterholes, so how much of the waterhole is actually suitable for fish as habitat, and particularly focused on identifying days where waterhole failure is likely based on thresholds of tolerability being exceeded. So these are the 6 sites that fed into this project, and on the left you see my highly skilled diagram of what the sensor arrays look like. And on the right, you see one of our boys being deployed by Jay and one of the guys from Deegan. The modelling, like I mentioned, takes information from hydrology. Local information became really important for this. That's a really key finding of this is some of the localised microclimate drivers as important as the broader scale climate drivers. But as a result of calibrating these data to models, the UWA guys were able to come up with models that accurately represented observation across these 6 sites. So here's an example for temperature, the top one being the observed logger data and the bottom one being the model representation of that, the calibrated model. And again for oxygen saturation. So this is the percentage of oxygen dissolved in the water compared with what is theoretically possible. This is a good measure of availability to aquatic gill-breathing animals. And again, we have a model that well represents the measured data across the 6 waterholes. So the next thing we did was collect fish out in the field and take them back to University of Queensland. And they looked at hypoxia tolerance trials and temperature tolerance trials for these species. And the key findings from this was the the tolerance to hypoxia is directly related to temperature. So the hotter it becomes, the less tolerant of hypoxia the fish are. And that tolerance is species specific, with the really annoying finding that by far the most tolerant species is introduced European carp compared with the native fish species. So basically the European carp could go into anaerobic respiration for quite extended periods, whereas native fish were unable to do that. So carp are very well suited to living in these harsh environments, which is possibly one of the reasons why they often dominate the biomass in our systems. Taking that information, the guys were able to develop a habitat suitability index, which varies depending on the water temperature, and is based on how much dissolved oxygen there is in the water. So for each species, there are a series of curves at different temperatures, and classifying the conditions into high quality, habitable, or marginal and intolerable conditions. And then these were applied to the models, the oxygen and temperature models. So this is based on what actually happened during 2019, 2020 that we're seeing here. So for carp, you can see black, for all of these, black is intolerable, grey is marginal, and yellow is ideal. And you can see for carp, the top one, a lot of the time, a lot of the volume of the waterhole is ideal or suitable. Whereas for two of the native species here, bony brim and Murray cod, they both had very little good habitat, lots of unsuitable habitat, and at times nothing but unsuitable habitat. So these are the times where the system is likely to be either failing or being close to failing, and fish kills would be expected. I'm now going to move on to talking about some of the threats to waterholes. So all of the different aspects that are important drivers of waterhole persistence have different things that potentially threaten them. We've seen a little bit already how flow regime change can threaten persistence. Also, of course, direct take of water out of waterholes can reduce the amount of depth and how long they persist. But also a quite large problem in some parts of the Queensland Murray-Darling is sedimentation and infilling of waterholes, making them shallower and therefore less able to hold water and last during droughts. So climate change is the first one. We had this massive extreme set of conditions across the northern basin and much of the rest of Australia during 2018 to 2020, where we had both the hottest and the driest climates on record at the same time. What we found, well, I talked about how we've got these 60-odd calibrated waterhole models, and they worked really well, and the calibrations were all pretty low error. But what we found during the drought at some sites was that they started losing water at rates that were much higher than the models predicted. You might just say, well, that's because there was more evaporation, but that doesn't really make sense, because evaporation is one of the input parameters to the water loss in the model. So we're looking at loss rates increasing beyond what can be explained by evaporation. And as an example, one of the sites where we had our oxygen loggers in the Moonie went from losing 1 metre in 170 days to losing 1 metre in 100 days. So that's a change from 6 millimetres to 10 millimetres per day of water loss. And the interesting thing is that this didn't happen everywhere. Some sites, the old model still worked well, but some they didn't. And we don't really understand what was driving this. Perhaps sites where there was no soil moisture storage or no shallow alluvial groundwater nearby had greater evapotranspiration uptake by local trees, but that's just speculative. we really do need to understand better what was driving that, because under future climate, it's possible that our predictions of how long waterholes last might need to be readjusted if we can understand why they're losing water at this particular time faster. Another climate change effect with that, and with that hypoxia and fish project, we used the Queensland climate change dashboard data to look at how conditions that were relevant to the models might change into the future. And we can see that under an extreme climate change scenario, there's quite a large decrease in the amount of habitable volume over time. So this was really just a bit of a proof of concept for this, and the plans are to try and do this in a bit more sophisticated way in future work. But it just shows how oxygen stress for fish is likely to be a greater threat to their survival in waterholes in the future under climate change. I mentioned sediment accumulation. We've done a bit of work on this, but a lot more is needed to understand what's going on. But in this study that we did in the Moonie River, we found extensive accumulation of fine sediments since the 1950s that had reduced waterhole persistence for some of the biggest, deepest waterholes in the system by over 200 days. We looked at before and after a 1 in 100-year flood through the system, and the 1 in 100-year flood in the system didn't scour this sediment back out. It only took like a quarter or so of what had been deposited since the 1950s. And we don't really know if that is a process that's continuing or if it's a legacy of change that happened back in the 50s with land clearing, which was like the 50s, 60s was the big time for land clearing in this area. But what we do know is that the sediments are being incrementally deposited, but not being removed. So it does suggest that ongoing deposition is a problem. In this particular part of the world, we can't blame water resource development because the flow regime here is not particularly affected. It's fairly natural. So it does seem like what we're dealing with is an increase in supply of sediment to the system rather than a loss of the capacity of the system to scour. So we've looked a little bit about the relationship between flow and potential scour. We've done that using the Doppler stream gauging data that the hydrographers collect for rating stream gauges. And we've reanalyzed that data to pull out near stream bed velocities at different flow stages, and to try and get a better understanding of what are the flow conditions that generate the maximum amount of capacity to scour waterholes of sediment and maintain their depth. I think it's fair to say we need to do more of this because the results are variable between sites, and we don't really understand at this stage what's driving that variability. It might not be something that people initially think of, but I think turbidity in these Western Murray-Darling rivers is actually one of the greatest threats to their ability to function as refugia. It limits light penetration into the water column, and that limits the amount of food that the river is able to generate from algal production. There's no good, concise historical data on turbidity for these rivers, but there's plenty of anecdotal evidence, for example, from reading the descriptions of these rivers from the first European explorers who went through, that they were much less turbid than they are today, and also that they were much more productive in terms of fish biomass that they supported than they are today. Some of our work has quantified how turbidity does affect the available habitat for algal production, and the plots you can see at the bottom are the general relationship between light penetration to a depth where algal production is possible versus turbidity, and you can see it's a log relationship. And for a particular waterhole, how turbidity influences the potential production of algal food resources in that waterhole at different depths, different stages in the drying process. So moving into all of this, how it gets used in the water plans. So first of all, most of the protection of the environment in Queensland water plans is through planned environmental water, which basically leaves water in the system that's not taken out by users. And this process sets the acceptable level of risk to the ecosystem, which is informed by the environmental assessments that are done. So things such as conditions on take, water sharing rules, infrastructure rules, flow event management rules, are the things that protect this planned environmental water. We also have environmental flow objectives, which I understand you guys have had a few talks on in recent weeks, which ensure that any changes to water allocations don't increase the risks to the outcomes of the ecological outcomes of the plan. And in the Murray-Darling plans, in particular around waterholes, I'll show you an example from the Condamine in a sec, but the total number of days without flow-in spells greater than waterhole persistence time must not be increased due to a change in water allocation is the basic logic around the EFOs related to waterholes. There's also operational rules, which are designed to manage particular risks. For example, most allocations requiring a passing flow of a particular volume before water can be taken, and this is partly to protect waterholes. Some, however, have what's known as a zero passing flow allocation, which means the holder of that entitlement can take water directly from a waterhole during no flow periods, but it may then set drawdown limits or annual volumetric limits to how much they can take. There's also the annual environmental stock and domestic release in the lower Balonne from storage, which is specifically designed to top up waterholes, both for ecological as well as for the benefit of stock and domestic repair and water users who take water from waterholes. So this is how that gets codified into an EFO. This is from the Condamine Balonne water plan. So they do tend to express it in terms that the cryptic crossword aficionados amongst you would appreciate. But basically it's trying to do what I said before, is that over a whole model simulation period, the proportion of days where spells are longer than the amount of time it takes for a waterhole to dry up can't be increased. And for different parts of the system, it's expressed those as different spell durations, which is based on the waterhole modelling that's been done for those particular parts of the system. And that last point is very interesting, though, 5 megalitres per day. So if, like, from an ecological point of view, it's cessation of flow we're talking about, but from a model point of view, it has to be something higher than that because the models aren't able or aren't designed, and the gaugings aren't really designed either, to be very accurate at differentiating a small volume of actual flow from cessation of flow. So to be precautionary, it's always something more than zero, either 5 or something around about 5 is commonly used. Queensland doesn't hold any, but the Commonwealth holds environmental water, which is water that's used specifically for managing ecological benefits. In Queensland, almost all of this is unsupplemented water, which is basically the equivalent of licenses or entitlements that the Commonwealth Environmental Water office owns, and instead of taking that water for irrigation or whatever, they just own it but leave it in the river. A small amount is held in storage for managed environmental use. Once you start moving south of the border, a lot more of the QA's environmental water is held in storage for managed use. And the QA are increasingly exploring event-based mechanisms where they temporarily trade to secure water when it's really critical for the environment. An example of this was in late 2020 during the peak of the drought, when they bought water to top up waterholes and help native fish survive by improving water quality and increasing persistence of drying waterholes. There's also an increasing trend to try and piggyback environmental water with water that's being released for other purposes. And I guess that's possibly something that's less happening in Queensland than in some other parts of the basin. There's also other types of management of threats to waterholes where the research informs. For example, the work that Pete Negus and co have done has clearly shown that feral animals, pigs, and but also livestock cause damage to the bank and beds of dryland rivers and increase sedimentation rates into waterholes. And Southern Queensland Landscapes NRM Group have quite a large project to help control sedimentation by repairing fencing and providing off-channel watering points for cattle. New South Wales in particular has done a lot of work on drought risk management, where they've installed emergency mitigation measures such as aerators in waterholes where they're worried oxygen's about to crash and fish are about to die. And some of the work that we're doing on modelling fish risks will provide good insights into potential mitigation measures and the timing of mitigation that would be necessary for such actions in the future. And I think just finally, this has only just been made live, but there's a new tool that's linked to the water modelling information portal online, which is where you can look up the flow of all the gauges in Queensland, which is basically a fish risk assessment, which counts the number of days since the last flow event at each gauge. And there's some interim risk thresholds set there. So at a glance, you can look across all the gauges now and say which parts of the system might be at risk of waterhole failure and therefore fish death events. And this is one of the state's requirements for reporting to the MDBA particularly during drought times, of what are the risks to fish, of fish kills. And this new tool will save those of us who had to do this manually in the past a lot of effort. So it's a simple innovation, but it's a really useful one. And with that, I come to an end and just recognise that all the work I've been presenting today has happened over very many years and with very many contributors and helpers. And I've listed all the ones I could think of here, but I've also probably forgotten some. So apologies if you're one of those. But yeah, it's been the work of many. So that's it. I've finished. So I'll stop sharing and happy to answer any questions. Is anyone still awake?
Some of us are still here.
John, because you're talking to a group of modelers here, can you tell us what your model, when you talk about these models that you got?
Yeah.
What are the models like? What are they?
Oh, they're basically water balance models, Sarah. So
of a waterhole.
Of a waterhole, yeah. So the waterhole is represented by its bathymetry. So it has a table that represents depth, volume, and area at intervals from full to empty, and it has the calibration parameters, daily seepage rate, which is millimeters per day, and daily evaporation multiplier, because what we found is, so they're basically doing similar things, but evaporation multiplier takes the input of the solo daily evaporation and adjusts it, whereas the daily seepage is a set rate every single day. And so by tweaking those two parameters, they're the main ones that are necessary for fine-tuning these. But there's also the ability to adjust rainfall catchment area for the waterhole, because rainfall is one of the inputs as well. So you can have rainfall without flow that increases waterhole depth. There's a groundwater influence parameter, but like I said, none of our systems really have much of a groundwater influence, so we don't usually need to turn that on in any way. Have I forgotten anything, Jay? Tell me if I've forgotten anything. But yeah, basically, that's what it does. It adjusts those parameters from the inputs that you put in, which is assume flow stopped, so flow zero, rainfall, evaporation, and the time series of depth that you've measured are the inputs. And then you've got the shape of the waterhole from the bathymetric representation, and the parameters are adjusted to match the observations.
And your outputs of temperature and oxygen saturation are functions of what?
That's a completely different type of model.
Okay.
That's nothing. That's not the persistence model. And if I start talking about that model, I'm getting very much into the realms of not understanding it myself, because this is what the guys at UWA have developed. At the moment, that's not operationalized to be a water plan assessment model, but the next phase of the project will include doing that, because at the moment it doesn't have a daily time step, for instance. So yeah, the plan is to turn it into a model where we can put the entire 120 years or whatever in model periods of when the fish risk for this particular waterhole may have been.
Yeah, that's exciting.
Yeah, it is. It's cool.
Because I guess what I was thinking when you were talking about these models is, I mean, I don't know what, like, are you running those? Is that what you've transferred over to Python now, or?
Yeah,
because I was kind of thinking, like, what would happen if we put these same waterholes into, like, directly into the source model, for instance. It'd be just interesting to see if we could parameterize the thing in a similar way.
Yeah, so definitely the waterhole modeling module, which has been historically in Ecomodeler, is now in the new replacement software, but no one's used it yet. No one's used it yet. I've not even, like, we haven't had a final presentation of what it looks like or anything yet, but yeah, I think you could definitely play around with what you're suggesting once you've got the model.
Yeah, it sounds like you could spend a lot of time having a lot of fun in this space. So, but thanks for your presentation. I'll hand over to everyone else who wants to talk about. That was just my question.
Thanks, Sarah.
I've just got a question, John. With the work you're doing, like it seems like it's really cutting edge type stuff. Is similar stuff happening in other states, or are we ahead of the other states? Or
yeah, we're ahead of the other states. So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about has only really been done in the Lake Eyre Basin and in Queensland. I'm not totally sure what South Australia is up to, but waterholes and persistence is very important down there too, because it's a very arid sort of landscape. But New South Wales, from what I've seen, they measure a lot of things, but they haven't got the sophistication of the modelling and the understanding of the processes quite so much. But they do a lot more hands-on risk management stuff than we do, because they get like tens of millions of dollars to rescue fish during droughts and things like that. So it's like, I guess it's like our purposes are to feed into the water plans, whereas they have a lot more hands-on fisheries management and stuff that feeds off sort of similar type of information, but maybe not quite so process driven. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. They're more sort of reactive rather than proactive.
Yeah.
The other thing I was sort of thinking too, like you're talking about the Murray-Darling Basin here. Have you got as much stuff going on in the other basins, or?
No, it's one of the realities is that a lot of external funding that pays for these things
Is for the MDB.
is for the MDB, and
Yeah.
it's much harder to get projects up elsewhere. So it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that you got the background, like you need a lot of background information. For example,
Yeah.
to do that Anoxia project, we had heaps of background information that I haven't talked about that you just don't have anywhere else. So you couldn't really have done it so easily anywhere else without spending a lot more money on things like measuring waterhole metabolism rates and things like that, which we've done in the Murray-Darling quite a bit.
Have you looked at any sort of transference of what you found in the Murray-Darling onto other systems? Sort of,
well, Lake Eyre Basin, they've done a fair bit of this stuff. And like I've never sat down with those guys, and the regional biologists in other catchments have done like waterhole modelling too, but there's never been an exercise to see how transferable everything is between. I know, like Jay and I did a project in the Gulf many years ago as part of the track program, federally funded track program, and we found up there it's much harder to predict waterhole persistence because there's inconsistencies in seepage rates, but like individual waterholes lose water at very different rates up there compared with the fairly consistent rate we see in the Murray-Darling. So we're quite lucky that we can study, like a handful of waterholes and assume they represent the whole system here. But I think if you're working in the Gulf, you pretty much need to look at all of them individually to understand how long they're going to last, or just rely on satellite image analysis, I guess.
No, it's all very interesting. Thank you very much for the talk.
My pleasure.
Guessing that's no one else, so we might wrap it up there.
Cool.
Again, thanks, John. That was really, really fascinating.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, John.
See you all later.